Father Alexander Rentel is Chancellor of the USCA and has taught canon law at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary for many years. Father Alexander is one of just a handful of Orthodox academics whose focus is on the canonical tradition of the Orthodox Church. I know there's a lot of interest in the canons and in the canonical tradition, and so I was really glad for the opportunity to sit down with Father Alexander recently. So without further ado, I hope you'll enjoy this episode from my interview with Father Alexander Rentel.
Fundamental distinction in the canonical tradition, that is to say, whether somebody is in the church or out of the church, and this could involve something both, especially a person, is the following: is somebody in communion or not? It's often as simple as that. Are you in communion with the church? So there are any number of categories, of course, that the canonical tradition has. Belong to heretics. Basil the Great elaborates schismatics, people who belong to illegal congregations, what he calls parasynagogues, contrary assemblies. But then there are also people, and something that has to be very carefully noted, who are excommunicated for some reason, where they're in the church but somehow not quite in the church because they're not in communion. Because, as I say, the fundamental distinction in the church, within the canonical tradition, about being in the church or not, are you in communion with the church? Now, at a bigger level, there are further distinctions that are made with regard to churches. And the canonical tradition reserves exclusively for the church the appellation Catholic. The Catholic Church is the church. And what it designates everybody else who's not in that church is often by the leader of the heresy, or their particular practice. So the Quatrodecimans, people who celebrated Easter, Pascha in late antiquity on the 14th of Nisan, according to the Jewish calendar, they appear regularly for whatever reason in the canonical tradition, and they're labeled the Quatrodecimans. Arians, people who follow Arius, Macedonians, so on. The followers of the New Prophecy, Montanus, and whatnot. So the canonical tradition makes a point of calling them by their name of their sect, of their group, and refuses them the title of the Universal Church, the Catholic Church. I think is a very key point. But again, the same criteria could be made, or can be made, as with an individual. Is this church in communion with the church? And that's what makes the designation of, is this church canonical? Is this church authentic? Are they, what we would say nowadays, are they orthodox? Are the bishops in communion? The signs of unity, are they present? And again, chiefly, are they in communion with each other? And the Orthodox Church, I think, especially in the modern world, has always maintained this, especially in ecumenical dialogues, that communion is not a way towards unity, but it is the ultimate sign of unity. So not only in the canonical tradition, but I would say especially into the modern era, there is this fundamental canonical point. Are you in communion? Now, having said that, of course, we know the painful reality that there are churches, there are Orthodox churches that are sometimes in communion with one or another church, but not in the rest of the church. And we consider these as temporary experience of the church and not something permanent. I think back to the very painful splits that took place after the so-called Russian Revolution, where there are many groups who ultimately had derived from the Russian Orthodox Church. I was about to say the Moscow Patriarchate, but derived from the Russian Orthodox Church, which then eventually, the Patriarchate was restored, but were not in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, and sometimes not with each other. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, for example, for years was in communion with Serbia, Jerusalem, these patriarchates, but not always with some of the others. My own church, the Orthodox Church in America, went through a very painful period when they were not in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. Again, I think these are temporary experiences, and by the grace of God, the schisms were healed. And I emphasize by the grace of God, these schisms were healed. These splits, I even loathe to call them schisms, but these splits were healed by God's grace, working through hierarchs and dedicated church people. So what is a canonical church? I think especially these churches that are in communion with each other. And in the church, we have no doctrine that you have to be in communion with such and such a bishop along the lines of, in the Western Church, you have to be in communion with the Pope of Rome to be considered Catholic. But I do think that there is a very good sign that if you're in communion with the Patriarchate of Constantinople, that is typically a sign that you're in communion with all of the other Orthodox churches. And so you are canonical. Further remark about that, of course, I brought up the experience of my own church, the Orthodox Church in America. We received autocephaly from the Patriarchate of Moscow in the early 70s, and while the autocephaly has not fully been recognized by all of the churches, we have nevertheless never experienced since that time a state and experience of being non-canonical. We've served, we continue to serve with the churches, all of the Orthodox churches worldwide, even though our particular status is ambiguous to some. So you can be canonical, you can be in communion, but perhaps your status can be unclear with some people.
Hi again. Hope you enjoyed this episode from my interview with Father Alexander Rentel. Please subscribe to get notified when new videos become available. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of this channel. There's a link to the patronage page of our website below this video. Thanks so much for your support, and we'll see you soon.